I'd like to call on Christy Rowland to kick us off tonight.
Thank you, Councilmember Corman. Thank you, all of Council. I appreciate your time tonight, and thank you to our guests in the audience. My name is Christy Rowland. I have been your Deputy Chief Administrative Officer now for 1 week, but I have had the privilege of working in the city for almost 15 years. And over the last several months, I've worked with the folks that you are about to hear from on where are we spending our $1590 and what are we going to do initially? Where's our first dollar going to go, and what should we be doing going forward? So you're going to hear today from a number of people who've been involved in this process, as well as, I can see I'm committing the error. I'm going to stop my share. Excuse me. How dare I do that? There we go. Thank you. I, of all people, should not be doing that. Continuing on, you're going to hear about a little bit about the needs assessment that has been conducted. You're going to hear about a couple of ready-to-go programs and projects that are in place and ready to go. And you're also going to hear about what's next. So this is not to say we've got all the answers here today. We have a new department who will be chewing on this together and working through things. But these will be the initial steps. So just to get you reoriented about what it is our City Council Ordinance 5983 adopted this new revenue source of housing and mental and behavioral health services that are made possible through a 0.1% sales tax. At least 60% of it must be used for affordable housing and housing related services, and up to 40% can be used for programming. The target groups that are eligible to be served by these funds are listed here, and you'll hear more about that in our presentation. Veterans, senior citizens, to name a few. And with that, I'm going to ask each of our presenters to introduce themselves as they take the reins. And our first presenter will be Hannah Von Miller, who, again, just to let you know, is only going to be reviewing a high level of the needs assessment. A more in-depth review will be made available to you in September. And Preeti Sridhar will be talking about that at the end of this. But Hannah, I'm going to hand it off to you, and you can let me know when to switch slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy.
Thank you so much, Christy, and good evening, council members. My name is Hannah Von Miller. I'm the Housing Programs Manager for the city. And as Christy mentioned, my portion of the presentation today is regarding the HB 1590 Needs Assessment, which is a partial assessment of housing and human services needs that are related to the uses allowed under this legislation. In terms of project scope, we brought on consultants to review existing data to understand needs in the community for housing and housing related services. We also have them coordinate targeted interviews with providers of affordable housing and mental and behavioral health services. Using that, they determined gaps in capacity and highlighted opportunities for targeted funding. The intention of this needs assessment was to use some related work that was already being completed by the same consultants in the city's housing action plan. Next slide, Christy. So today I'll be giving a high-level overview of the current and expected needs. As Christy mentioned, there'll be future opportunities for council to dig deeper into this work. So know that there's more work to support future decision making, but today I just wanted to give you an overview of housing and homelessness needs. So to start, I wanted to showcase what our housing needs look like by our area median income, which is a measure of relative income using a county standard. And this shows that about 27% of households in Renton are making at or below 50% area median income. These are households that are considered by HUD to be very low or extremely low income households. And when we look by tenure, we see major differences in that about 40% of renters make 50% AMI or below, and this is compared to 16% of owners. Next slide, please. With rental housing, while about 40% of households are making about 50% AMI or below, only about 31% of our rental units are affordable to them. So this is saying that there exists a large gap between the number of households who make a certain income level and the number of units affordable to them. This is most severe at households making 30% of the area median income below. We have about 22% of our renter households that end up competing over about 9% of the housing stock that is affordable to them. Next slide, please. In terms of future need, we can understand our future housing needs through several different methods. The first method shown here was a projection that was used in the Housing Action Plan to understand how much housing we may need at different income levels in the future. Next slide. This work, the Housing Action Plan work, was based on previous regional growth measures for the city. Very recently, there were new growth targets approved under the countywide planning policies that were passed the Growth Management Planning Council in July 2021. And under this, Renton has a new target of about 17,000 housing units to grow between 2019 and 2024. This amount was not allocated by income, but using the previous proportions, this would show that we would need around 4,750 new units that are affordable to 60% AMI or below, including about 1,650 new units affordable to 30% AMI or below. So meeting the needs of these 1,650 new units would require at least $500 to $650 million in today's dollars just to build these units over the next 25 years. Additionally, there would be more support that would be needed for the other 3,100 units that would need to be affordable to other incomes below 60% AMI. Next slide. So running any of the numbers around affordable housing, it becomes very apparent that even a portion of our needs will exceed the amount of funding that we can receive from the HB 1590 sales tax receipt. And as such, prioritization and leveraging of housing funding is going to be very essential to maximizing the efficacy of these dollars. In terms of homelessness, we do not have numbers that are specific to Renton. There are different metrics to look at, one of which is the point in time count, which is conducted across King County. And within King County, Renton is within the Southwest geography. And so in the Southwest geography, there are about 1,100 people experiencing homelessness, and a decreasing proportion of these have access to temporary or emergency shelter. Next slide, please. So to boil it down to some Renton-specific numbers, we did a couple of things. So one was we looked at the past permanent address of people experiencing homelessness and found that about 6% of countywide respondents reported their last permanent address was in Renton. And this was the second most frequent response after Seattle. Further, if we take the number of people in the Southwest area who are unsheltered, and we take a population proportionate share of Renton, we would have an additional 200 unsheltered people that would need to be addressed as our share of that Southwest total. And this would be both physical space and staff for case management. Next slide, please. Another way to understand homelessness is to look at some of the metrics collected by the Renton School District. For the 2018-2019 school year, they reported 634 students were homeless, and this includes 74% of those being reported as doubled up. So these folks might not be unsheltered homeless, but they might be in conditions that are not adequate for their housing situation. Next slide. Our consultants were also able to look at our spending and support that we currently offer. And calculations from the Washington State Auditor's Office highlight that we have had regular funding of social services in Renton that has been increasing over time, both in terms of absolute contributions as well as per capita. This next slide, excuse me. There has been contributions to a number of housing projects within the last 5 years, including the projects that you see listed here, including several by the Renton Housing Authority. Next slide. As well as you can see some of our contributions to different shelters, mental and behavioral health services, and other community centers. So in 2021, there was a direct financial contribution to the Reach Center of Hope, as well as there's been some past contributions to the programs you see here, as well as the Sunset Neighborhood Center. Next slide. The support you see here is what we are able to provide through our human services funding, and a total of 562,000 was funded in 2019 to 2020 to the following organizations, and this was the average contribution of about $12,000 to each organization. As mentioned, our consultants were also able to conduct outreach to a number of housing and human services providers who serve the Renton community. Next slide, please. And you can see here a snapshot of the outreach that was conducted with representatives of the following organizations. Our consultants did a combination of individual interviews with different staff, as well as group interviews that brought service providers together to discuss the issues in the community. Next slide, please. Some of the conclusions that came out of the outreach that was conducted, you can see here. The first is clear funding priorities are really needed for this revenue, acknowledging that it will not totally fill the gaps in the local systems that we have. Also pointed out was that available resources should be providing stable funding support. So this means that having patient flexible funding for capital projects, having long-term commitments for staffing, and or flexible grants and loans for short-term needs are ways to best support our service providers. And overall, there is a need to maintain accountability and service quality through the funding, which may be more possible to oversee with larger, more comprehensive expenditures. So those conclusions were things that we heard from our service providers, and we were able to take that information and boil it into our recommendations tonight. So first off, we have some considerations, and then we've outlined near, mid, and long-term recommendations. But the considerations play a key role. So the city should leverage available funding using relationships with local service providers. New funding allocations should focus on investments that can leverage external resources. These two are both very important. It's really speaking to, the fact that our opportunities with this funding come from our partnerships, both with our service providers as well as potential partnerships with funders. As we all know, this revenue presents long-term opportunities for reliable support. And throughout this work, we also heard that equity considerations should be a primary concern. We didn't dig into some of this today, but there are disproportionate impacts in housing and human services, and so paying attention to that in our solutions is important. There are several regional issues that were pointed to in this needs assessment, and opportunities where it is more beneficial for us to support regional collaborations than to do local responses. As well as there was a consideration that our funding models should be focused on more support, that we should be making holistic allocations and solutions. So the last consideration is that long-term planning must consider ongoing support for maintenance and operations. One of the big benefits of this funding source is the flexibility to allow funding to support operations and other additional needs beyond capital. So for our recommendations, they are divided between program administration, facility support, and programmatic support, and again mentioned the 3 timeframes of interest. Today, we're just going to look at our short-term recommendations, and next slide, Christy. And over the first 1 to 3 years, the recommendation is to focus on initial capacity building, including leveraging funding for strategic acquisitions. So major actions under in these first 3 years would be overall management of the revenue source, including the development of an advisory committee, acquisition of housing units and land for future development, and this would be done through strategic leveraging of funds with partners and other funding sources. They recommend the development of a permanent emergency shelter with supportive services, as well as having capital and maintenance funding to develop affordable housing. Finally, there are 2 pilot programs that are recommended, a behavioral health field response, as well as pilot programs for behavioral health services and rental assistance. So those are quite a number of things we could be doing in the short term. Mid and long-term recommendations will focus on evaluation and realignment of the pilot programs and development of housing options using the acquired resources. And finally, there's opportunities for additional development of shelter options within the city in the mid and long term. And with that, concludes my section of the presentation, and I will pass it off to the next folks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Next, we have Deputy Chief Keys and Cindy Morris from the Police Department talking about the Behavioral Health Navigator program.
Good evening, it's Kevin Keys. I'm the Deputy Chief of Police here for the Police Department of the city. And I have, I guess, the first proposed program that's ready to go, which is a mental health co-responder program that we believe will better address the needs of those in our community experiencing behavioral health crisis. So why the Navigator program? So as far back as I can remember, there's always been a gap in services provided to those in behavioral health crisis. Police officers have been tasked with managing behavioral health related issues with limited training and no real expertise. Recent demands for police reform and changes in legislation have precipitated the need to implement some sort of mental health co-responder program to essentially relieve officers from the responsibility of deciding what is or is not appropriate treatment for those experiencing behavioral health crises. The Navigator program does just that. It helps law enforcement agencies expand mental health field response capabilities, utilizing mental health professionals to competently, humanely, and safely respond to crises involving persons with behavioral health issues and recommend treatment, diversion, and reduce incarceration time as the primary goals. How our plan came together? The idea for a Navigator program, as I said earlier, was really born out of the necessity to bridge the gap in services for those in behavioral health crisis, essentially turning over the decision-making process to a mental health professional who has the education, expertise, and training to more effectively address the needs of those in crisis and provide the wraparound services necessary to prevent those suffering from mental health issues from repeated and unnecessary encounters with law enforcement. What other cities are doing right now? Currently, South King County cities or agencies share Navigator, which is housed in Kent. Agencies like Redmond and Baltimore PD have similar co-responder programs to address behavioral health related issues. Their mental health professionals aid in crisis assessment and de-escalation, assessment of the individual for referrals to social services, and follow up with contacts, families, etc. after the crisis has abated. The MHP also provides education to families and the person in crisis to ease the routing through the crisis systems in the county and state. This essentially is akin to the goals and outcomes of our proposed program. What the program will provide is a behavioral health navigator who will essentially pair a police officer with a mental health professional and or police navigator who responds to calls for service, both emergent and non-emergent. Estimated program costs are roughly about $12,500 per month plus 56 cents per mile for the calls, the distance for calls for service will be measured from the police department. So essentially about $150,000 a year plus mileage. The expected outcomes really, which is really why this program will be favorable for the community and the police department. The program will connect individuals with behavioral health issues, experience a crisis, or at a risk of crisis to social services and treatment. It will connect individuals with behavioral health issues who are at risk of arrest or have been arrested to social services and treatment. Reduce police time spent on behavioral health related calls. They'll provide prosecutors with resource information relevant to diversion agreements, and it'll improve behavioral health services by promoting new approaches and identifying treatment gaps. That's essentially what this behavioral health navigator program will do. And that.
Good. Is now a good time for questions?
If you have any, certainly just a couple minutes of questions, and then we have another project to move on to.
Okay.
So
I'll just ask, does any council members have any questions? Councilmember Benedetti?
No questions, Commander Keys. I'm sorry, Deputy Chief. It's a delight is what this is. I could not be more pleased that this is the direction that you're looking at going. I think this is fantastic. Thank you so much for outlining the program.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Okay, I don't see any other hands raised, so I think we're ready to move on.
thank you. And we'll have them on at the end as well if you think of anything else. Next, we have Mark Santos Johnson to talk about the RHA Sunset Gardens project.
Good evening. My name is Mark Santos Johnson. I'm the Community Development and Housing Manager in the new Equity Housing and Human Services Department. We are also proposing tonight HB 5090 funding for the Renton Housing Authority's Sunset Gardens project. Next slide, please. Sunset Garden is RHA's 5th replacement housing project for the former, back to the photo, please, for the former Sunset Terrace Public Housing Project. To construct the project, RHA plans to temporarily relocate the current RHA office staff, demolish the current single-story RHA office building, and develop a new 4-story mixed-use building on the site with RHA office and resident service space on the ground floor and affordable housing on floors 2 through 4. Next slide, please. Sunset Gardens will include 76 studio and 1-bedroom affordable housing units. 100% of the units to be served are HB 1590 eligible target populations, including veterans, persons with disabilities, and seniors. All units will be subsidized, with half of the units serving those at below 30% of area median income and the remaining half serving those at below 50% of AMI. The project will be located 1 block away from the Renton Highlands Library and the Sunset Neighborhood Park and within walking distance of the Sunset Neighborhood Center. Next slide. The total project cost is approximately $45 million, including nearly $33 million for the residential development, $6.5 million for the podium and site development, and $6 million for the new RHA office and resident service spaces. RHA has 83% or almost $38 million of total funds needed for the project projected or secured at this time. To fill the project's remaining $7.5 million gap, RHA is requesting $1.5 million from the city, an additional $1.5 million from King County, and $4.5 million from the State Housing Trust Fund. RHA plans to start construction in the second quarter next year and complete construction with full occupancy by the fourth quarter of 2023. Next slide. Staff recommend that the council approve $1.5 million for the Sunset Gardens project, including $1 million from projected 2021 HB 1590 revenue and $500,000 from projected 2022 HB 1590 revenue. 100% of the city's funding will be used for the project's affordable housing development and construction costs, not RHA's office space. If the council approves the HB 1590 funds at this time, it will help RHA leverage the remaining county and state funds needed for the project. City funding will help advance the Sunset area community revitalization and provide critically needed additional affordable housing for very low and extremely low income veterans, seniors, and persons with disabilities in our community. Providing funding will also continue a long and successful partnership between RHA and the city to address the community's affordable housing needs. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Mark. If there are any immediate questions, we can take them now, or we'll move on.
Councilmember Benedetti.
Thank you. Sorry to be the questioner here tonight. I am wondering if there are any opportunities made available through ARPA for this particular project, if there's areas of funding that are specific that we would want to try and apply for now. I know that the funding application process is fast and furious for a lot of those monies right now.
There are local ARPA funds available, which the city leadership and council will be figuring out in the future how to best spend that money. And there are additional federal dollars that RHA is trying to secure for the project, but they're a long shot given all of the needs in the state. But they are continuing to pursue other opportunities to try and address the needs, particularly for what we're trying to secure from the county and the state for the remaining funding gap.
Councilmember McGurven.
Thank you. I think I got a little bit of the question I was going to ask, which was other options if what we're looking at for the funding gap doesn't come through. So I think you were addressing that somewhat in your answer. But a huge fan of the project, so that's mostly what I was saying is to make sure we can make sure that 7.5 gap gets narrowed or eliminated.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay.
All right, well, next we have Kelly Beamer, who's going to give us an update on behavioral health and homeless resource center options.
Christy, good evening, council members. Kelly Beamer, Parks and Recreation Administrator. Would like to touch base quickly that this plan and program started prior to the reorganization, so the departments that we'll be working with together as a team will be with Public Works where facilities lies, and then the new EHS department where Human Services will lie. So we'll be continuing to work through this together. We are currently evaluating site locations to house our new behavioral health center. We've hired a consultant for the architectural services and designs, as it shows here, to review preliminary the engineering needs for the sites, doing the site surveys, looking at interior exterior layouts that would benefit these programs and the outside of the facility, so it's friendly to our individual clients. It also encompasses a hygiene center, which has been very, very highly needed throughout the city, and so this will be part of the entire site. The $1,590 costs are one-time costs for the construction and site improvements, and we don't have those numbers as we are still evaluating the site location. Those will be coming to you as soon as we can get those. Next slide, please. And then the second portion of that is the actual management of the resource center. So the city currently has RFQ posted out to our service providers. We've met preliminarily with a lot of them so we can identify the needs as it showed in with Hannah's presentation earlier from our consultant doing the surveys. It'll specifically address the items that are located in here, the overall management of the facility for people that are experiencing near or they are homeless, mental health evaluations and counseling, including outreach services, also including will be housing navigation and job training and basic needs to transition to permanent housing. Definitely will be a location now for permanent severe weather shelter when that is needed to be activated. Develop a crisis team, which again will we anticipate partnering with the police and their navigation mental health program Navigator, and it will also be a touchdown area for police as well as we get individuals that are referred to the facility. The costs and hours of operation, as we've noted, are going through the process now as we go through the RFQ, and we will be prioritizing how we offer these and the hours offered so that we align with the available 1590 funding.
Thank you, Kelly. If there are any questions for this this portion, now would be the time.
Great. Council, any questions? Councilmember Halloran.
Yes, thank you. Is this a follow-on to where we were going to be at St. Vincent de Paul and we got the $120,000 financing through legislation? Is this the same project?
Yes, very similar project. And it was actually, I believe, 206,000 from the state that we received. So,
Oh, yes, yes.
so yes, in line with that. And now, like I said, evaluating the location, and we've got the RFQ out. So yes.
Thank you.
Councilmember Benedetti.
Thank you, Council President. Just a question for you, Kelly. When you say evaluating the location, what are some of the spots that are being looked at right now?
We have a couple we've been looking at. Looked at the vacant area in the Providence site, potential use of the 300 Rainier building as well. There's, again, priorities with funding and restrictions, so trying to look at what is the best use of those funds and best location for this type of facility.
Councilmember, I'm sorry. Is there a follow-up?
There was just a quick follow-up. What criteria are you using to evaluate the sites?
Again, the major criteria is funding. What will it take to be able to establish these and partnerships as well? Because we continue to work through, again, the RFQ process for Providence. So securing the site for the 40+ years that we are needing to secure to use the 206,000 from the state. There's eligibility requirements with that. And then obviously 300 Rainier site is a city-owned property, but also within FAA regulations. So we're having to work through those parameters as well. But a lot of it is the funding criteria. Obviously, there's a lot of needs for this money, and we want to make sure as a city that we're prioritizing where things go efficiently.
Councilmember Van.
Thank you, Council President Foreman. Part of my question was answered, but I do have another question regarding the part where you mentioned, Kelly, develop a crisis team. Could you kind of, I know it's still in progress, but is there like a number that you're thinking as far as professionals, mental therapists, just kind of giving us a little bit of detail if you do have it.
Yeah, that's part of, yeah, thank you for the question. The RFQ has, again, it's a request for quotes and proposal from the management service providers. So depending on their capacity, again, we anticipate this starting out, I don't want to say baby steps, but we want to make sure it's successful. So we want to make sure that we're offering exactly what is needed and the capacity of the service providers. The crisis team is an outreach team similar to the police, where we'll have social services, we'll have peer, if you will, related people that have familiarity with homelessness. And so if we need to address what we identify as a chronic homeless, individuals that typically have refused services, so we try to get in, get the trust level built up so that they can and will want to accept the services and work their way out of homelessness. So the numbers would fluctuate depending on the size of the program as we get the proposals back.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, we could move on.
All right, Carrie, we'll give it to you next. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Carrie Roller. I'm the finance administrator, and just want to talk with you a little bit about the projected revenues we're anticipating for these funds. As Christy mentioned, they're a percentage of our sales tax. So as our economy does well and our sales tax comes in, these figures will go up, and they fluctuate just based on how our economy is doing. Based on the figures that we've currently received thus far, we had originally estimated pretty conservatively about 2.1 million of revenues for the year, but we're increasing that to about 2.6 because we're getting in a little bit more than had previously expected. I have indicated our two requests for you this evening. The RHA contribution as well as the police mental health navigator. And then after we take those two things out, we have about $1.6 million left of funds that we're projecting to be available by the end of the year. As a reminder, these funds are restricted. So at a minimum, 60% of the total revenues need to be used for construction of affordable housing, mental health, behavioral health related facilities, and operating and maintenance costs for these new affordable housing. So of the 1.6 that were projected that we haven't earmarked yet through after this evening's meeting, about 584,000 of the 1.6 is restricted for the most restrictive use, the 60% category. As I mentioned, as our economy grows, so too will these annual proceeds. And so it's really nice to be able to see as our economy gets better, it'll just get bigger. The other thing that's wonderful about this is an ongoing revenue source for our city to use for some very important areas of need. At the council retreat earlier this year, we talked about looking at the overall funding for human services, and this revenue source has helped tremendously to add a significant amount of support to these community needs. That coupled with the funds we already budgeted through our various programs, such as direct support for our community partners, housing repair program, domestic violence support, we have increased our human services commitment to approximately 2.8% of the general fund budget. The goal was to get to a target of 1%, so we're almost to 3 times that number. If we add staff time into this figure and also some of the future costs for the community court, the percentage would be even higher. These percentages represent only the annual ongoing commitments. In addition, as Mark had previously mentioned, or Hannah had previously mentioned, that we have some one-time projects as well that we've contributed to them in the past and anticipate to do so in the future as well. So as Hannah's chart had shown, we're definitely moving in the right direction. And I will hand it off to Preeti.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Council President, Council members. So for me, I guess it's also been a week as taking over the new department, Equity, Housing and Human Services. So I'm very excited to launch the new department and these new priorities. I do remember at our council retreat last time, where all these areas were actually brought forward and discussed as a group. And so it's wonderful, kind of coming together and making this a reality. So as we mentioned today throughout the presentation, the next steps are really the critical next steps as we implement these funds, as we look into, take a deep dive into these areas. We continue to explore together the details of the Homeless Resource Center. We will come to you in September to begin the mid to long range planning for the use of the $1590. We have been looking at and will bring the full report of the needs assessment and also scope out the timeline of the human services needs assessment. Lastly, we've been talking about the Equity Commission. We also have a lot of vacancies in the Human Services Commission. We've done a thorough analysis of the Equity Commission, spoken to various groups of community members, and have a recommendation that the mayor and Ed are looking at, and we hope to bring that to you as well. So very excited, and this comes from your direction at the retreat and really the ask for the community. And we're very excited that we actually have the resources and the direction backing us to, to really get back to the community and bring these important needs to fruition. Thank you.
Thanks, Preeti. Questions? Okay. Well, great. is that, I guess that's sort of the end of the presentation, right?
Yes, thank you very much. We do hope to receive your authorization to proceed with the 2 proposals today, and we'll have a committee report for you for that.
Okay,
and
great.
You'll be hearing from Preeti and her new team about a future cow, like she just described, to get a little bit more into the weeds of things and getting some direction on longer term projects.
Okay, well, I thank you, and does council have any concerns about my approving those reports? Seeing none, I'll plan on approving those and bring them forward. Okay, so that's it, really. I think that was the only item on tonight's agenda. So with that, I will adjourn the committee of the whole, and we'll reconvene in 20 minutes for the regular council meeting. Thank you all.